Greetings, psychology students. Professor Zeeb here, and welcome to our lecture on expertise. Basically, what expertise means, an example of cognition from our cognitive unit, Chapter 8. It's basically a high level of thinking or knowledge in a particular field, for example, anthropology or mathematics, etc., etc. So what we're going to do is go through the research of expertise and kind of look at some of the different facts that we've discovered in studying experts. One of the things they've noticed about experts is that they are not necessarily born with this ability. Certainly that could be the case, but we're finding that a lot of times that experts are not necessarily born with the ability to become an expert. Rather, in a lot of cases, we're finding is that expertise develops through extensive experience, not necessarily innate intelligence. So in other words, it may be that they're not necessarily born a genius. I mean, of course, that could happen. But when we look at the average IQ of different areas of expertise, we're finding that's not quite the case. Typically, what we're finding is that it takes lots and lots of experience. Now, by extensive experience here, we are talking 10 years of concentrated practice. So on average, we would find it's about 10 years of practice that it would take to sort of obtain that skill or that level. Some researchers believe it takes about 10,000 hours, but I think that depends on the person because some people have a natural ability and thus it would take them less time. But if we average all of that out, we think it's about 10 years. Expertise is probably not completely independent of inborn talents and or predispositions. Remember, we said that practice seems to be very important, but certainly some people come into the situation with advantages, which gives them more likelihood of becoming an expert. So obviously that does play into it. So some people are naturally gifted, some people practice a lot, and some people show both. So it kind of depends on the person specifically. We've also discovered that feedback seems to be critically important here. So feedback seems to be one of the essential things to allow you to become an expert. Why is that? Well, obviously this person, whether it's a coach, a parent, a teacher, etc., is going to observe you and critique you. I mean, obviously in sports, this is why we have coaches, because they make the players better. So in other words, they can point out things that you did great, they can point out things that you're not doing so well, and thus comment on those different areas to allow the person to improve. So it seems that most experts we've discovered have someone in their life who is providing this feedback to allow them to improve as a person. Experts also show an increase in brain structures. So in other words, what we're saying is that sometimes we see that brain areas are larger. They have more tissue when we compare an expert to, say, a novice. As you would sort of think, the area of the brain that is usually bigger is something that's related to their level of expertise. So for example, a musician may have, advanced areas of the brain in terms of timing or hearing, for example. So you could argue that this practice has allowed that part of the brain to grow and enrich and strengthen, or you could also argue that possibly they had bigger brains to begin with, and this allowed them to become an expert. So I think it could work sort of both ways there. Expertise can definitely cause a growth in the brain, but also having a bigger brain could lead to being an expert. So I think it kind of depends. Probably both of those areas would be important. All right, so we're going to take a look at a specific form of expertise as we go to our next slide here. And that is expert pattern recognition. What that basically means, if you're an expert pattern recognizer, you can look at a pattern and recognize the important features quickly. In other words, they can do this more efficiently compared to an average person. So of course, our classic example of this would be an expert chess player. to be an expert chess player, not only are you gifted in the game of chess, but you could also argue that they're very familiar with the patterns of the game and can quickly recognize important positions of pieces in reference to the game, which allows them to do well in the game of chess. So there was a particular study that examined chess players, expert chess players, and they wanted to know, do these experts, in this case chess players, have a better memory overall? So in other words, are they an expert chess player because they have a superior memory compared to people who are, say, beginners at chess? This particular study comes from De Groot back in 1966, so it is an older classic study. What they did is they showed the subjects different patterns of chess pieces, like on a computer screen or something. They broke up the subjects into two groups. Our first group are basically our expert chess players. So these are people, obviously, that are well versed in the game of chess. And then our second group would be our novices. So in other words, beginners at chess. And so they compared these two groups in the experiment. The subjects were shown two different conditions of chess pieces. So for example, they may have been shown chess pieces from an actual game situation, as you see above. This probably is something that could appear in a chess game. I'm not really sure. I'm not a big chess player, but it seems like it would be so. And in the second condition, they showed them more random pieces. So they placed the pieces randomly on the board. Each of these patterns or photographs were shown for 5 seconds. And then the person was asked to recall the position of the pieces. So they would show them one at a time for 5 seconds. The person would have to respond, where were the chess pieces? The difference being that it's an actual game versus a random situation. And then, of course, comparing the experts to the novices. Here's what they found. When the pieces were arranged, to reflect an actual game situation, they found that the experts did much better at recalling the patterns. So for example, the experts recalled 91% correctly, where the beginners, it was only about 41%. However, when the pieces were completely random, they found no difference between the two groups. So as you can see, what this basically shows is that expert chess players do not necessarily have a better memory. What we think is happening is that they can recognize key patterns that novices basically would overlook. In other words, because they're well skilled and experienced in the game of chess, they know which positions are probably important and have experienced those before. So thus, it's not necessarily that they have a better memory in general. They're just more knowledgeable about the game of chess and familiar with key patterns that seem to matter in the game. So that's an important point, is that a lot of times with expertise, we find that it may not be a general ability, but a specific ability related to that actual skill. Certainly with pattern recognizing would be an example of that. All right, so this will conclude our lecture here, and please progress to the next step in the class.